All right. It looks like we are good to go. Hi, John.
Hello. It's great to see you,
Thank
Nick.
you. Yes, likewise. It's been a good little while.
Yeah.
um, well, thank you very much, both on behalf of myself and for the rest of the community here for joining us for the Q&A today. How have you been?
Um, I've been good. It's been the last 10 days have been kind of a whirlwind because of the video with Jordan Peterson. But uh, I just sort of had set myself to just ride that wave, however it unfolded, and so um, it is what it is. I was always happy with the video. Um, it wasn't what I was expecting, but many people have commented on that. But I went in and I really set myself to try and practice dialogos as best I possibly could in that context. Because I wanted to indicate, that's the wrong word. I wanted to exemplify to Jordan as well as talk to him about dialogos. And I wanted it to be very much something that he was seeing and not just that I was just telling him about and talking about.
Right.
So it seems from the feedback in the comments that I had some success on that. And so in terms of that, I enjoyed it greatly. Um, I remembered again, we haven't spoken in person in 5 years, but I remembered again why I like Jordan. And I felt genuine affection and friendship expressed by him, and I hope that I reciprocated in kind. I'm looking forward to us talking again, and I think there's uh, much of good value that can come out of our future discussions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think everyone can agree that you showed a tremendous amount of patience and restraint in that conversation, particularly in the first half, and did a very good job at steering it towards a more constructive dialogue or dialogos in this case.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and my personal reading, the whole second half of the conversation was absolutely wonderful. And
Mm.
yeah, one almost kind of got the feeling that there was too much trying to be said in
Yeah,
too tight of a span of time, so it had a
yeah,
kind of a freneticness about it.
yeah.
But
There was too many things happening at once, I think. I mean, I think there was a significant degree of Jordan and I catching up and reconnecting and getting back onto sort of a personal level and not just talking sort of abstractly at each other. Uh, and then there was that, and then there was the sort of proper content of the conversation that came out in the second half, as you said. Um, and so, I'm looking forward. Jonathan Pajot and Jordan and I are going to record again on September the 10th. So I imagine towards the end of September, early October, that will be released. And I'm looking forward to that a lot. I think that one will be um, a little bit more flowing.
awesome. Is that a in-person conversation, or will that be through
That'll be
online
recorded on
means?
Jordan's channel. That's going to be recorded on
Okay.
Jordan's channel again. Yeah,
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a wonderful conversation. I'm definitely looking forward to that.
yeah. Me too.
All right. Well, shall we launch into the questions here?
Please.
All right. So, our first one is Matthias asks, what did your girlfriend say about your relationship to Christianity that JBP cut you off before you could explain?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, my girlfriend, my partner, we don't have a term for our relationship that quite suits. My girlfriend sounds too juvenile. Um, she's my partner, but because she has kids and I have kids, we don't live together. So, there isn't quite a. She is my most significant my only and most significant romantic partner. Wow, I almost made a mistake there. Um, and so her position is basically that sort of officially, um, she's an atheist. Like when we started dating, that's how she self-identified, um, and um, she's a tremendously deep person. That's one of the reasons I'm with her. One of the things I love about her, and she has, I think, a proper mystical, spiritual, aesthetic dimension that I find deeply attractive. So, but nevertheless, her sort of the position of her and her extended family is sort of one of official atheism. But she sat me down at one point. We were talking, and she said, I'm trying to quote this as verbatim as I can, but it's not exactly verbatim. She said, "I think you're the only true Christian I've ever met." That's what she said.
Interesting. Right. So it seems. Sorry. Continue.
I was just going to say that, and then Kyle. I forget Kyle's last name. He put out a video just recently. Something like John Vervaeke patiently answers every question. Very humorous hyperbole. But he said the same thing to me. He said to me that he sees. I hesitate to say this. I'm just reporting what other people have said. But he said he saw a Christ-likeness in me that he thought was important, and he wanted to discuss that with me. So I had a person who's one of the closest people to me in my life, and then somebody who's, I know Kyle, but we've only spoken once before, relatively, third person, both saying this in relatively, close proximity in time, and it sort of took me back. And I was trying to understand how to take that, how to properly receive it, how to properly respond to it, how to understand it. So that's the answer to the question.
Nice. Yeah, I would imagine that's it probably has even a bit more. I'm not quite sure what the word I'm looking for is. It seems like it would be more bizarre hearing that comment from a non-Christian than from a Christian. And
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say it kind of reminds me of, I think it was on Pajot's channel. He was asked, right, if Christianity is the truth, why does it seem so many are untransformed by that truth? And I can't help but feel a relationship there between, I don't know, perhaps this ability to embody a belief system as opposed to subscribe to one.
I've noted that that comment on Peugeot's channel, that question, and I agree with you. I think there is some connection to people making that attribution to me. I don't quite know what that means for me. I'm genuinely trying to stay open about that, and I mean, there's two things in me that Scylla and Charybdis that I want to sail between. One is the egocentric narcissism to say, well, of course, because I'm a sage on earth and people are only recognizing that kind of ridiculous, hubristic crap, right? And then the other is, no, by all means, no. Don't they know how Christianity, the version that I encountered, hurt me? And these two extremes would block me from being in right relationship, genuine relationship, to people that are trying to tell me something. And so I'm trying to stay open to what that means and to be patient about it, and neither cling on to it or throw it away, but trying to stay open-handed to it, and see how that unfolds in my self-understanding. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but that's the only answer I have right now.
I think it's a great answer, and I think honestly that would probably be a useful answer for many Christians themselves. Um, but yeah, it's well, okay. I could probably talk to you for quite a while about this topic, but I'll try and keep us moving through the questions here as we have quite a few of them.
I'll
Thank you
trust.
for
I'll
that.
trust in your leadership. Oh well, you're welcome.
All right. So from Richard, we have you briefly mentioned with Jordan Peterson why you select the term non-theist, and it having to do with dismantling assumptions baked into the theist-atheist dichotomy. As many have said, your most recent conversation with Rafe Kelly was a nice follow-up to Peterson, largely because you dive into those assumptions quite deeply. Can you succeed? Oh, I can't speak. Can you succinctly lay out the frame that modernism and postmodernism is trapped into, and explain how that relates to atheism, theism, and non-theism? And I actually have a slight follow-up question to this, which would be, how do you separate out non-theism from something like apophatic theology?
Mm-hmm. So I'll answer the first question first, although I want to indicate right from the beginning, I think the second question is deeply pertinent, and I think it is pretty much almost entailed by any answer I give to the first question. So thank you for putting them together like that. That's helpful to me, because that way I can look forward. So what is shared about modernism and postmodernism is that's a hard topic. But the shared presuppositions are largely those of modernity. I think it's correct and important to see postmodernism as a culminating critique of modernity. When I mean the ideological worldview framework that was given to us in the Enlightenment in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Basically by the 3 R's, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution. Right? And so what modernity is an affirmation of both the necessity and sufficiency of a bunch of claims. Primarily, these claims are claims of this kind of set of ideas. I'm trying to not use jargon as much as I possibly can. But one set of ideas is the idea of that truth is accessible by the application of a method, not through a rational method, not through the personal transformation of the knower. So the knower, so if you compare, let's say, Augustine to Descartes, and that's a fair comparison because they share a lot of similar arguments, as many people pointed out to Descartes in his time. So it's a fair comparison. But if you compare them, right, you see that Augustine is basically arguing individuals have to go through this fundamental transformation, and only after they do that will certain truths be disclosed to them. At least that's how I interpret Augustine. Whereas Descartes says, no, you don't have to go through any transformation. All you need to do is use this method, and he's very, very confident in this method. This method will give you access to all truths, all the truths of the universe, all the truths of God, all the truths of humanity. And it's a very powerful confidence. That confidence is born out of another presupposition, assumption of postmodernism that becomes a presupposition in post-modernity, which is a deeply entrenched nominalism. And nominalism is the idea, I'm trying not to use too much, but nominalism is the idea coming from Duns Scotus and Occam. I talk about this a bit in my series. And this is where Jonathan is more radical than people realize, Jonathan Pajot. Because nominalism claims basically there are no real patterns. Right? There are no real patterns. The patterns are only patterns in our mind. Our mind is what links things together and makes the patterns. All that's out there are raw, absurd individuals, absurd in the very technical sense. of absurd. Like they have, ultimately in themselves, they have no categorical meaning. There are no universals, all that kind of stuff. And see, once you think that, then you're put in this very weird position where all that the patterns are just in your mind, and then you just have to get them to rationally cohere with each other. The mind, somehow the patterns are real in your mind, and the mind knows them directly, but there's no patterns in the world, and the mind doesn't know them. And so a powerful dualism opens up between the mind and the world. And you're going to get Descartes and Kant coming out of all of that. Right. Now, what happens in the Enlightenment is the idea, wait, and it's a really weird thing that comes through Galileo, because Galileo brings some Platonism in a weird way to address the nominalism. I think his instinct is right. I think ultimately Platonism is what you need to address nominalism. But what Galileo says is math is the language of the universe. So for everything else, we have nominalism, but math actually finds the real patterns, right? And people have to appreciate that special privilege because the people in the Enlightenment thought they had a response to nominalism, which was that math seemed to track the new emerging empirical science, experimental science, and the new astronomy. And so it was like, but there is a language of the universe. That's what Galileo called it, and that's math. And that's why you've got the prioritization of math, and then everything tries to imitate math. So we get the idea of knowledge as a formal system, right? A formal logical mathematical system. So a purely structural, as the postmodernists will later say, because they also call themselves post-structuralists, this purely formal structure, and all we're going for is logical coherence. And then that brings the third thing, which is reason is nothing but logic. Reason is nothing but logic. Okay, so all of those three actually fit together very, very profoundly, if you think about it.
Now we're in, just to track it, now we're in like Kripke, Hilbert, the formalists, pre-Gödel, basically.
Yep, and also you can even see that in people like Levi-Strauss in anthropology, where you have structuralism within anthropology, and you're trying to understand culture as a purely formal system. Or what's going to be crucial for a lot of the post-modernists is you have Saussure in linguistic, who sees language as a purely formal system. That's why he constantly uses the analogy of chess to explain language, because chess is a prototypically formal system. What do I mean by a formal system? The chess pieces don't have any meaning in relation to the world. They only have a meaning that I assign to them within the game. And that's only a meaning of how they function with respect to each other. It's a purely formal, purely self-contained, possessing no intrinsic meaning, and that I only give it as I play with it and manipulate it and use it. And you see what a notion of language and culture and reason and knowledge you get from this.
Right.
Okay, so that's modernity, right? And there's more to it, but and what postmodernism does is it basically comes and said, and basically it's bound to it, because what it does is it critiques it. So let's go the other way. So is language a formal system? The deep answer is no. The deep answer is no. This is why the problem of getting real meaning into AI, right? This is the Chinese room problem and a whole bunch of other problems for those of you who know philosophy. The problem of getting meaning, not for us as we use it like a chess piece, the computer, but meaning that would be meaning for the computer even if all of us disappeared. Trying to get that into has proved to be a tremendous problem. So I want to make it clear that this argument isn't just coming out of the postmodernists, but what they basically said is, right? So Derrida, his central notion of difference, right? He assumes that Saussure is right about sort of syntax and semantics, and then says, but notice every term has its meaning not just in terms of a structure, but I'm always moving from one term to another. That's the deferring. And then what I'm noting is the difference between them, the contrast. So you combine deferring and differing to get difference. And what he says, I think completely correctly, is that can't be captured in the formal structure. because every time I try to
Right.
capture it with a formal structure, I'm just replicating the problem. And that's why you can't sort of get outside of this problem in an
Right.
important way. Now, for me, I think that's an important point to make. Now, here's what I'm going to say, and I think I could even make some textual arguments about this, given his debate with John Searle and others, but I'll just make it out here in good faith, and hopefully it'll be received in good faith. I think that the problem we came to in the computational theory of mind that I just alluded to became the problem of relevance. And people within the computational framework, like Jerry Fodor, right, said you can't account for, and he is a defender of the computational theory. He said, but what the things it can't do is tell you how genuine development, transformational development occurs, because you can't infer a stronger logic from a weaker logic, and you can't get relevance into your computational, logical, mathematical formal system. And I think that's totally right. That's the whole project, the problem of relevance realization. So I see Derrida and Derrida's difference and my relevance realization. I'm not claiming they're identical, but man, could they have a very good conversation with each other. They converge on a lot of things. Now, and then if you move up next to the privileging, right, the idea of, that nominalism is the case, well, you have this weird version of it. You have, again, that there's no transcendent signified, right? There's nothing really beyond or outside the play of symbols, which is nominalism. But then what they do is, right, they do the same thing. They want to privilege, but a certain kind of sign play as somehow getting us to reality. And this is where many people make critiques. And so what you get is, well, somehow there's the language of ethics, and this is from Levinas ultimately through Derrida, but also I don't want to do too much scholarship. But also you get the privileging of moral discourse. Somehow math isn't the language of reality. Morality is the language of reality. But that doesn't work with all of the problems that you can't sort of deduce, right? So what kind of knowledge is it? Well, it's no kind of knowledge. And you get this weird, you get these weird things where like in Foucault, you're showing the deep interconnections between knowledge, sort of the formal system idea, and power. That's what can't be captured in the formal system, and how they're interdependent with each other. But somehow we can critique this, right? And we can, but because of justice or oppression, or the abuse of power, but so somehow these are privileged real patterns, and this is this weird thing. So it basically, how I see it is postmodernism is like modernism, committed to nominalism with the escape clause, because if you go pure nominalism, you get pure dualism, pure skepticism, pure solipsism. But the escape clause isn't math, it's morality, but not a morality grounded in anything. It's just like math. It's supposed to be a priori, that we just know that these things are wrong and these things are good.
Right,
so
a morality born purely from critique, seemingly.
Yes.
Like it can't get underneath itself, right? It's
it can't get underneath itself, and it can't ultimately situate its normativity within its own practice. So you practice this on behalf of a justice or a freedom from oppression that can't be properly situated within your deconstruction or your archaeology of knowledge, Derrida and Foucault, right? So notice how they are that. So when you have an assumption between two positions that are opposed, that's a presupposition. And we're seeing presuppositions here about logic, knowledge, reality, meaning, and you also have the shared assumption that I don't have to undergo any deep personal transformation in order to get access to these moral truths, right? I just have a method. I do this sort of deconstructive method, right. And then from the epitome of my guilt or something, I then get access to the real patterns of justice and power and oppression. So what I would want to say, if you agree that those three that the idea of deep truths without deep transformation should be questioned, because that's a shared presupposition. The presupposition of nominalism with the only one privileged way of getting through should be abandoned. Should be abandoned. That's what I've tried to do with a lot of the trying to bring back Platonism and trying to show the other kinds of knowing is, no, a deep challenge of that nominalist presupposition. And then finally, a deep challenge of the presupposition that reason is logic. And instead, open up the notion of reason, link it back to transformation, and
Right.
in the notion of wisdom. So that, for me, is what I'm trying to do in... so I take postmodernism very seriously because I take modernity seriously, and then I try... Wow, this sounds really hubristic. What I'm trying to do, please remember that verb, is I'm trying to get at their shared presuppositions and challenge the shared presuppositions. So I'll let you respond, Nick, before I go on to the second part, which is linking it to the theism and non-theism. And then the third part would be to address the supplementary question.
Right. I mean, I thought that was a wonderful layout of how that development took place. I guess the one thing that kept popping up in my mind is how it seems like we end up in these kind of Gödelian loops.
Yes,
even within modernism, are we still stuck in this Gödelian loop? And I think that's important because I think a lot of people have a romanticism about modernism as not being in that loop, as being where we broke free from that loop. So I think it's important. I really love how you tied modernism and postmodernism as basically suffering from the same problem, just switching the area in which it functions. And on the other end, I find it really interesting how you placed postmodernism's kind of pattern recognition in the realm of moral, particularly as we watch postmodernism move ever deeper into the culture and its practice, and how it has started creating seemingly these types of pseudo religions that have and it's interesting, right? Because you can see the desire for transformation within those pseudo religions, but it's so bound in technique, if you will, that it can't actually transform itself. So what's the final state of the white male is to just endlessly be cycling in his own critique of himself, right? It doesn't actually get well, and this is perhaps interesting when it comes to theism and non-theism, in the sense that there's a distinct lack of a telos of what that transformation is. And we've spoken about this before, but it seems dangerous, right? We don't want to create a telos that is static, but it seems like we still need a teleological vision that perhaps describes what a optimal state of evolution is, or dynamicness, an optimal dynamicness as opposed to a perfect static.
I think that's right. I'm torn now between replying to that new point, which is a really juicy one, or still going through. And no. So I'm going to ask you to remember that point and remind me about it, because I want to first, because we're broaching into the theism, non-theism. And so, by the way, I like that this is flowing dialogically. I appreciate that. So thank you. I really appreciate that. It helps me a lot. So I think the thing about theism and non-theism is, let's do first the theism, atheism. So I'm going to try and make a parallel move, right? And the parallel move is a move of, well, what are the shared presuppositions? Because I think it's fair to say, and many atheists actually explicitly say this, that atheism isn't a substantial position, it is merely the negation of theism. And therefore, it's going to be very much analogous how postmodernism isn't something that has a substantial independent content, but is parasitic on modernism. So if postmodernism ever succeeded, it would disappear because its raison d'etre would disappear. Right? Same thing with atheism. And I suppose many atheists, that's sort of their utopic vision. So what are the assumptions that are shared by both sides, with one side affirming and the other side negating and locked together? Well, one, and this, I mean, this is going to get us into a debate at some point, and I welcome it, by the way. Paul and JP and I are going to do this, and I welcome this debate, but I'm going to put it aside because I'm going to be responsible to the debate, but maybe I don't have time to do that completely right here. Which is a debate around what do we actually mean by theism. And, and again, here's another way in which Jonathan Pajot. So Jonathan Pajot is way more radical than people realize. I was asked about this and I thought I'd answer it, because he's rejecting nominalism at a profound level. He thinks there are real patterns everywhere, as far as I can tell, right? And they have a life of their own. They have an independent existence to which we have to respond. That makes him much more radical than most of modern Christianity, because modern Christianity, especially Luther is explicitly and deeply influenced by nominalism. Deeply, right? And this has been insinuated into Protestantism, I would say, and I welcome Paul's response on this, and it has become pervasive of Christianity through the Counter-Reformation, etc. Eastern Orthodoxy, not as much, because it's still tied to Neoplatonism. So that's one way in which Jonathan's more radical. Jonathan's more radical in that he thinks, he said it explicitly publicly, so this is fair, that there's a real possibility that Christianity is going to die and be resurrected into a form that we cannot see. That makes him a radical Christian in the way Kierkegaard was a radical Christian, because he sees the death, right? And so we may be seeing the death of all of our current understandings of theism. There's a position out there called anatheism, which is what you get after you pass from theism into atheism and then back into something beyond both of them. And I see that as a species of non-theism. And so, by the way,
that's from Nishitani?
Non-theism is not, and anatheism is, I forget who originally there's a book, I think it's the anthology's Carey. I may be misremembering, so I apologize if I've miscited. Okay. There's actually a book called Anatheism, which is it's an anthology, I believe. I have it. I haven't had a chance to read it, but anyways. So, and I want to point out that Paul Tillich, one of the great Protestant theologians of the 20th century, in several places, and in one place in specifically even titles this way, that his ultimate concern, and that was his definition of faith, is for the God beyond the God of theism, because only the God beyond the God of theism can rescue us from the meaning crisis, because he was worried about the meaning crisis. And so, right, so this is not some strange thing. This is, right? Okay, so back to it. Now that
I would argue, just to throw a tiny bit in, I would argue that's attempted to be put very deeply within the Christian tradition in one of the 10 commandments being, do not form an idol unto God, right? Yes, and in many ways, the God of theism is very easy to form an idol of.
Very, very much so, and you're exactly right about that. One of the deep abiding concerns of Tillich, because of his resistance to Nazism, he's the first non-Jewish academic to be persecuted by the Nazis, and unlike Heidegger, he resisted the Nazis, and precisely because, and I think, right, and due to, like, his deep critique of idolatry, because that's how he properly, I think correctly, understood Nazism. Okay, so, and again, you get mystics doing the same thing. You get, Eckhart, for example, making a deep and important distinction between God and the Godhead, right? So enough sort of trying to normalize this and show this. This isn't sort of some new strange thing. This is something that has been thought about a lot. Okay, so let's take it off there. What are the shared presuppositions that we're challenging? And one of them is the idea, and this goes to Heidegger, the ontotheological critique, the idea that being, or the ground of being, is a kind of being. So a standard definition, for example, in classical theism, maybe I'll label that that way because I understand that theism is itself in negotiation right now, given what I've just said, is God is the supreme being, the supreme being. So that, and then what you try to do in theism is you try to amass evidence and argument for the existence of the supreme being, and then, right, in atheism, you try to amass evidence and argument against it. And what's problematic about that, and it's shown in that history I just talked about, is God can't be a being. That doesn't ultimately make any sense, because it's a category mistake. What we want is the ground of being, sort of capital B, that which makes any and all beings possible. If God is a being, then he is just in the set of all beings. Even if he's the biggest being of all, there's God plus all the beings, and and that whole has to be accounted for. So you have to do something very radical to break out of it. And I would argue that that's exactly the radicalness that the mystics are constantly calling people to, right? As they're trying to say, ultimately, you can't think of God as a being. Now that's problematic, and let me try to show you why. And I'm not trying to be offensive here. I really do. I hope you believe. I'm very deeply respectful of people who have committed their lives to a religious framework. I hold that in very high regard. But for example, and notice how tricky this gets. Well, but God is a person. But all the persons I know are beings, right? Right? They're limited entities. In fact, that's one of their defining properties. If you sort of dissolve into an ocean, I can't really find you as a person anymore, right? You have to be a thing. You have to be an individual. That's why I have to treat you specifically and personally. When we mean personally, we mean often, we don't just mean, I don't want to be reductive, but part of what we mean is specifically, individually. I don't treat you as just humanity. I treat you as nip, right?
Right.
So, when we think of God as a person, but God can't be a thing, what is it we're thinking? And then we try to say things, well, God's more like a person than anything else, and you see Thomas Aquinas doing this, but he's even more not like a person than he's like a person, because he so transcends it. And for me, that I don't want to insult the angelic doctor, but for me that's a bit of a dodge. For me it's like, well, what you're basically saying is, it's sort of useful, but the only justifications are very pragmatic, right? So that's one of the shared presuppositions.
I think I would actually push back on this by, I think, using your own move, which is to say, I think that so long as we keep that within the realm of the propositional, it absolutely is a dodge. But I think that suspending those definitions, right, almost like this constant throwing between the hemispheres of the apophatic and
apophatic and cataphatic,
enables a particular what's the other part of apophatic? I'm sorry.
Cataphatic, when you're making affirmations.
Okay, got it. Yes. It enables transformation if done within a proper... I
agree. And so I think that the question then becomes, are we trying to make an assertion, or are we trying to come into right relationship to, like, the ground of being, which is akin to sort of what Tillich was talking about.
Right.
Can we get ultimate concern for what is ultimate, and what is ultimate is not a thing. But notice what we did. We sort of bashed the affirmation and negation against each other, the theism and the atheism, and then we transcended it into something that moves beyond the second presupposition, which is that that the proper relationship to God is a relationship of belief. Right? And that's shared by both the theist and the atheist. But notice notice how that starts to overlap with the shared presuppositions of modernity. Because this doesn't require a profound, transformation in order to have this reality disclosed to you. All you have to do is get the proper set of beliefs and assemble them into a coherent manner for yourself, and then affirm them. And then what the theist does is affirm them, and the atheist, denies them. And then the move you just made is exactly the move that the non-theist wants to do. The non-theist wants to say, no, I want to get outside of limiting this to belief as the primary way of doing this. And I want to think, again, notice how we're now talking the same language as before. I want to say that there are multiple channels and there are multiple real patterns. And in order to get into right relationship with reality, I need those multiple channels and those multiple right real patterns in order to get the best possible, I don't know, frame, lens by which to try and see what is ultimate, what is ultimately real. And see, so that's the second presupposition and how it links in. Then what? Go ahead if you wanted to say something, Nick. I don't want to just keep talking.
I'm almost curious at that point if figures like some of the early church fathers then would be classified as non-theistic
So
in their...
yeah, I would. I mean, I think I gave you quotes from Eckhart, and Eckhart
Right.
points back to Dionysius, Dionysius the Areopagite, and I think Dionysius, I mean, he's clearly Neoplatonic in a profound way, and Neoplatonism and Platonism are properly understood as non-theistic. And Gerson has made a very good argument. Gerson is a colleague of mine at the University of Toronto, and I know all of the important work in the world right now is being done at the University of Toronto. That is in fact correct. So he has made a very good argument that, you know, Aristotle is actually a Platonist, a deep Platonist. And so when Aquinas brings in Aristotle, he's bringing in another form of non-theism. He does amazing things to try and get the God of the Bible and the God of Aristotle to belong together. Whether or not that still works is a debatable question. So I think you can see. I have to modify it though, because how can I speak about this respectfully? The defining feature, of course, of the Christians, even the early church fathers, is the loyalty to Jesus, right? Jesus of Nazareth, and to see him as what would become the second person of the Trinity. And so there's definitely aspects also of theism. What you see, in fact, I think, in these people is this real tension between theism and non-theism. And what I see is, I see the mystics emphasizing the non-theism and the theologians emphasizing the theism. If you want me to answer the historical question. So the non-theist also does something else. The non-theist offers a meta-argument. An example is John Hipp. He's actually a Christian theologian, but he makes a very good argument. The meta-argument is this: why is the debate between the theist and the atheist irresolvable? It's a good question. Here's his answer: because the universe is spiritually ambiguous. The universe does not. The universe presents enough evidence for both sides that we can't ever resolve it. So the problem for me then was, okay, but what does that mean then? Well, that means, I think, that we're bound into a particular problem, which is we're trying to make a similarity judgment. We're trying to make a judgment about how similar processes we see in the cosmos are to the mind of a human being. We're making a similarity argument. Because similarities, like you and I, can just really disagree about whether two things are similar or not. Because I'll ask you, are an apple and an orange similar? And you may say, yeah, they're both fruits. And I'll say, but one is orange and the other is red, and one has this thick peel and one has a thin peel, right? And the point is, this is a deep point, and it's made by Nelson Goodman, which is there is no logical way of assigning similarity, because any two objects share an indefinitely large number of properties and fail to share. So there is no way in which we can logically resolve this. We can't say, look, this is why finally my judgment of the similarity trumps your judgment of the non-similarity.
Right. You get lost in a Rorschach test.
Yes. And so for me, right, what that means is they're trying to decide between the theist and the atheist is exactly the wrong thing to do, because they're both, here it is, They're both presupposing that this is an issue that is decidable, that if we just get the right arguments and evidence, it will be decided. And the point the non-theists make is, no, it's an undecidable issue. Now, what that means, and what I see people doing, and I respect this, by the way, I respect this. I think this is existentially worthy. People will make pragmatic arguments. They'll say, well, for me, if I take the stance towards ultimate reality as personal, I get access to that transformation and a connectedness to reality that I can't get if I think about it impersonally. And I think that's part of Paul's finesse argument, the spirit of finesse,
right.
That if you, or the argument he asked me to critique. What I ask people to believe is I get arguments exactly the other way, where people say, no, if I think about it personally, I get disconnected and cut off. But if I think of it not impersonally, because that's more like the atheists, if I think of it transpersonally, like the way the mystics do, then I get an access that I normally don't get. Sorry, I got to take this. Hello?
No worries.
Yeah, just please leave it in the lobby or the entrance. So there's a package being delivered.
No worries.
So do you see the point? And so, Paul's argument is you bring in the spirit of finesse, and for Paul, that's bound up with the very sophisticated finesse we have to develop towards persons, and that gives us access. But what the non-theist will say is, yes, really, good. However, I practice Taoism. I practice Tai Chi. You know what Tai Chi is? It's the philosophy of finesse and flow. And it sees the ultimate impersonally as the Tao. So there's a way of cultivating that finesse that is also possible in an impersonal, or at least transpersonal, perhaps a better word. So what the non-theist... Please.
By moving into pragmatism, you actually, once you make that move, you lose your ability to navigate between the personal and the impersonal as having a kind of hierarchical priority.
Because you're caught in the weird epistemological metaphysical problem. Because if you move to pragmatism, you're justifying it in terms of how it works for you. That's James's final thing, right? But what you want to claim is no. It has an independent existence, which means it has to exist precisely by how it doesn't just work for you. I mean, that's what it is for something to be real. And so the pragmatism actually undermines any kind of ontological claim in a deep way. That's one of the deep problems of pragmatism itself. Something I want to talk to Jordan Peterson about at some point.
Absolutely, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
So did I do enough about all three of the? There was the postmodern modernism, the theism, non-theism, and then the discussion about the apophatic, cataphatic. I tried to sort of bring those all in.
That was absolutely wonderful, and I could probably talk to you about this all day. But out of respect for the questions I am tasked with reading, I think that was as full an answer as we could hope for.
Great.
All right, let's move on here. Sam Adams, we kind of, or rather, you kind of answered this at the very start of the conversation. I'll ask it just in case there's any little bit you'd like to add, but let's see. John, there have been many divergent takes on your conversation with Jordan Peterson. What is your take on the conversation? What can you share that would help us make sense of why it was so different from any of the conversations that either of you have had on YouTube prior to this?
First of all, I want to say hi to Sam, and I hope that he and I get a chance to talk again together.
That was such a great conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to have it again. And he and some of the other randos did a really excellent video commentary on the discussion between Jordan and I, with some, I think, fair criticisms of me and my approach. And so I'm very appreciative of that. Well, I don't know what's my take on it beyond what I've already said.
Yeah. I think you traced it out very well there at the beginning. I was just saying I thought you traced it out very well. There was definitely the two friends trying to reestablish a connection after 5 years of not speaking, and then trying to get into the content. I think a lot of people were pretty curious about Jordan's behavior in particular, because it was so different from what people were used to seeing from him.
I I choose I choose to take that as a compliment. I choose that to take that as a compliment in the sense that Jordan, because of our previous interactions, I think he has evidence and reason to believe that our conversation could go deeper than many of the conversations he typically has with other people. I know that's self-congratulatory on my part, but I have to do that in order to explain why I'm taking it as a compliment. I took it that he was very eager, very excited, maybe even a little anxious about the interaction, that he had expectations, which I think he largely felt were fulfilled, but given the way he sort of ended the talk.
He seemed
So,
very fulfilled by the end. Yes.
yeah, and tired and fulfilled.
Yes.
So I, because I acknowledge there's ambiguity. I'm given especially what I just said. I don't claim to have the definitive interpretation. I'm just being asked. So I'm choosing to take that behavior, Paul calls it shamanic, as complimentary to me, and that's consonant with the friendship and affection I felt for him. So for me, that's a consistent way of taking it.
Wonderful. All right. Matthias asks, your Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series encouraged me as a recovering atheist to continue on the path towards Christianity. Why do
Good.
you think your ideas can have this kind of impact, given the fact that you're not the typical Christian evangelist?
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope and aspire to this being the reason. I hope this is the reason, and I aspire to being the reason that I'm saying something very deeply true about meaning and religio and religion, and those all overlap for me, and I articulate that and that makes religion viable for people, and I don't mean belief viable. I mean William James viable. That it is a place wherein which you can undergo those kinds of transformations that disclose only the kinds of deep truths of connection that can be disclosed in such transformations, right? So I would hope that part of what I've tried to argue for a certain kind of, inevitability to the religious dimension of human beings and a deep functionality to that. And this is perhaps where my work does overlap with Paul's work and Jonathan's work. I think that's a sort of a common ground. Unlike the atheists, like sort of the new atheists like Sam Harris, I don't think of religion as a fundamental error or stupidity that human beings can fall into. Have people done grotesquely stupid things in the name of religion? Yes. But people do grotesquely stupid things in the name of everything. Politics,
Yep.
the market, right? Right? Everything. So science. Believe me, I'm on the inside, and I've seen people do really stupid things in the name of science. And I love science, right? So once we put things back on a level playing field, I think that the inevitability and the functionality of the religio dimension of human beings, and the need for practicing that within distributed cognition and therefore properly religion, I think is something that I hope that I've made good arguments for, and I could see why that would be a bridge of meaning, just to allude to your site here, for people, so that they could bridge between the scientific world and I don't like this adjective, but I don't have a better one, the spiritual world.
Right.
So I think that's why it has that. And I will say this again: if people find that they can return to one of the, by the way, people should know that this is also the case for Buddhists and Jews and Muslims. I also have Buddhists, Jews, and Muslims and even Hindus saying this to me, right? Just to be clear about this. So if my work allows people to return to a religious community wherein they find what Jesus promised, for example, the abundant life, which is a life like reciprocal opening, etc., the cultivation of wisdom, virtue, entering in a capacity to cultivate friendships and fellowships, and even what you might call, what Christianity calls worship, what other religions might call deep or profound reverence or something like that. I don't want to argue about that right now. But if people can find that self-transcendence, right, that's what I'm talking about. That's how I would talk about it. Then do it. Then I'm happy, right?
Yeah.
I'm happy. But
the sense I'm getting...
Good.
Sorry. The sense I'm getting is that in many ways you kind of opened up a field. You opened the space in this realm where people have been closed down for a while. And in some sense, when confronted with that space, people's elephants, to use the metaphor of the rider and the elephant, kind of take over and go, enter that field as through the path that the elephant knows, if you will.
Right. No, I like that. That's good. I guess, and this is where, of course, I disagree with Paul, but we do it in fellowship and friendship. Is I think that for many people, because I get this too. So as sincerely as I get people like Matthias saying, I was returned to Christianity, or I returned to Judaism, or whatever, I get people also saying, I'm alive to this, but they're nuns, N-O-N-E-S in a deep sense. But I can't make the religion I was brought up in, Christianity, for example, or Judaism. I just can't. I can't catch it. I want to. These people, a lot of them aren't hostile. They're not like, no, never. They're like, I wish I could, but I try, but it just doesn't work for me. So there's two options we have about that. One of them is to tell them, well, there's something wrong with you, and just try harder, and eventually you'll find your way to the church or the temple or the synagogue or the mosque. And okay, I can't do that in honesty. For me, I take them at their word and I say, all right, I believe you. I believe that's non-viable for you. Can we come up with an alternative so that you are not just standing there suffering, but from the meaning crisis, but so that there is an avenue for you by which you can respond to it deeply. And so that's something where, Paul and I differ on. Paul is not hostile. I've heard Paul say, he hopes my project, succeeds as much as it can. But he also is, he thinks it, I think in the video he released today, he thinks it's ultimately bankrupt, and it may well be. I continually say I don't have a foreclosure argument that, no, this is how the future is going to go, right? But that's why I do what I do, because I take the people, just as I take the people like Matthias who have said in good faith to me, I was able to return to Christianity or to Judaism or Buddhism. The people who say to me, I want to, but I can't return to the established religions. Is there some other way? I take them as speaking in good faith too. And for me, that's where I am. And I can't see for me an alternative to that.
Right. And I think regardless of what branch of that tree a person ends up finding themselves on, so long as the people participating in wherever they find themselves on it have that mentality and mode of interaction with it, I can't imagine not coming up with something better for everyone in any of those practices. So I think the approach is wholly correct, even if I would probably lean more towards wondering if it has the sustaining power. But at a certain point,
I think that's right. I mean, I take Paul's arguments about sustainability and scalability seriously. I keep responding to them, and Jonathan makes some of the ones, and I keep responding to them. I take them to heart, and I try to respond to them in good faith and in kind, because I think they're important.
Wonderful. All right. Um, here's one from Sanjuro. Um, there's evidence emerging since 2007 about a comet causing catastrophic damage to Earth and its inhabitants around 13,000 years ago, also known as the Younger Dryas impact. It was processed by a 1,000-year ice age and supposedly occurred just prior to the start of the Neolithic period. Are you aware of this theory, and how does the possibility coincide with your timeline of events proposed in the Meaning Crisis? How could this coincide with the shamanic traditions that arose and then were later integrated by Pythagoras? Thank you.
So I'm not aware of that theory. I want now, but now I deeply want to know about it. So um, it strikes me as plausible, precisely because I think Matt Rusano and other argument that the Upper Paleolithic transition was it was preceded. It was a precursor to a near extinction event for human beings.
Yeah.
Perhaps the
The flood.
supervolcano. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so and then what you got was you get the shrinking of the human population down considerably, and then you get the stuff I talked about in the series. You get the adaptive response are trade networks and diversification, and then these lead to cognitive complexification and ritual behaviors that feed into shamanism. So, I mean, shamanism precedes the 13,000. What this argument is claiming is that shamanism precedes that period that's being mentioned here, the 13,000, because
Right.
presumably shamanism is already in existence by the time of the cave art, which is around 30,000, 25,000 BCE. Now, I know that some of the models that I've seen for the advent of civilization in the Neolithic age already have a weird thing in them, where you get sort of the first cities, and then there seems to have been something like a drought, and they're almost universally abandoned. And what happens is there's like a 1 to 2,000 year period, and then agriculture is sort of rediscovered again. Maybe that's an echo of that earlier thing. I don't know. I'm not making a knowledge claim here. I'm arguing for the prima facie plausibility of this theory. What that might help to explain is perhaps when people come out the other side of that event, why shamanism is perhaps starting to be changed. Because one of the deep questions is, why do people take up agriculture? Why, like, what is it that's motivating this? Because we know that people like Tepe. I can't remember the name of it. Right.
Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. That people are building, monumental structures, ceremonial structures, something like cities before agriculture. They seem to be doing it for purely religious reasons, which is, again, really important.
And promptly burying it for some reason.
Yeah, very, very odd stuff that's going on. And it's a huge thing. It's a huge complex. It's not just one. It's a whole bunch of these linked together. Right. So I like what's going on there is like, yeah, why there's this shift? David Lewis Williams tries to ask that question, but I'm not sure it was satisfactory. But why does, if you'll allow me to be a little bit sloganistic, why does religion move out of the cave towards the temple? That's like, because shamanism is associated with caves, and that's where the rituals are, that's where the ceremonies are, that's where the cave art is, where everything's going. Why does it move from the cave to the temple? And your answer can't be because people took up agriculture, because that's the wrong story now. Something else moved them out of the cave into the temple. Maybe it was this event. I don't know. That's my best shot off the top of my head and out of ignorance to try.
You did a lot more with it than I expected, so hopefully Sandro is satisfied there.
I hope so. I tried my
Um,
best.
yes, it was a great attempt. All right, Tarnya um, asks, I have questions about 4E cognition and theodicy. In Eleanor
Mm,
Stump's book, Wandering in the Darkness, Narrative and the Problem of Suffering, she points to two kinds of knowing, propositional knowing and knowing which comes from doing and narrative,
yeah.
which I think aligns well with Ian McGilchrist's ideas around knowing as propositional truth and poetic ways of knowing, which he splits between the hemispheres.
Yeah.
Thus, sometimes we can make sense of our own suffering, not necessarily in a way that we can explain using propositional truth, but for example, through the meaning making, through our narratives, etc. I wonder if you might talk to the ways of knowing in 4E cognitive science that we might consider how to apply to the problem of suffering. For example, how we carry suffering in community, embodied knowing, which might include caring in such a way which supports a person in suffering, not through words, but through action or doing. Um, and then he wonders if these ideas could be applied to pastoral ministry.
Wow, that's a lot. So,
That is.
I mean, I want and need to talk to Ian again because I disagree with that labeling of the hemispheres, but in a way that's consistent with what I proposed to him when we had our first discussion. Um, so let's take it that at the core of poetry is the use of metaphor. I don't know what else you're doing there if you don't have metaphor.
Right.
Like what's distinguishing it? Because the idea that language is only in the left hemisphere is false, by the way. Right? Language is also in the right hemisphere.
Absolutely.
So that's not the distinction. Okay? So if you try to situate poetry in the right hemisphere, you're making a fundamental mistake because of the way metaphor works. It's funny because metaphor means to carry, metapherine, to carry across. And so if you take a look at the work on metaphor, because I do work on metaphor, published on metaphor, what you actually see is that metaphor is a result, like insight, of a dynamic movement between the hemispheres.
Right.
Right. So poetry isn't found in the right hemisphere, right, or the left hemisphere for prose. Right. What you have is basically you have the shift between the two hemispheres. If you were to be read Joe Bolte Taylor, if you're trapped just in the right hemisphere, you're not in poetry. You're in this. Right. You're like it's a horrific world. It's a horrific world. Like read My Stroke of Insight. Right. It's a world in which you can't even dial your phone. Right. Everything is blurring, and it's a world most properly designated by the term profound ambiguity than by the term poetry. Right.
There are no categories.
Well, and what you have is you have what's called coarse graining. What you have is you have a kind of associational framework, and poetry isn't association. If I go red, green, pepper, salt, that's not poetry. That's just random association, right? And so what you see is metaphor is a way of trying to either provoke or capture insight in propositional discourse. Because what happens in insight is a sudden shift from the left to the right hemisphere and then a return. Because I would argue that the hemisphere, look, you can't make this in terms of language use. This is a point I've made with you, because we have clear evidence for lateralization in species as primitive as frogs. Frogs! They don't have language, they don't have society, and they still have hemispheric specialization. They're not doing poetry and prose. What's going on here? The left hemisphere is dealing with well-defined problems for a frog, and the right hemisphere is dealing with ill-defined problems for a frog, like predation or like sudden opportunity, right? And so that's why it's organized the way it is. Trying to map this, see, Ian's not here to defend himself, so I won't say too much more. But trying to make that mapping, I think, is not sitting well with the cognitive science and the neuroscience that we have and the biology that we have. So instead,
As always,
go ahead.
as always, there's the tendency to anthropomorphize all of our understandings, which
Yeah,
often gives us funny results in these realms.
yeah, I think that's right. And the thing is, metaphor and narrative don't come naturally to us. This is another thing. They
Oh,
seem natural to us, but they both have to be like so. Language comes naturally to you. All you need is to be exposed to it, and you will get it. And think about how amazing that is. Chomsky built his whole career on, wow, here's this very complex, abstract, and its connection to what you actually utter is, and it's like poverty of stimulus and all, and like, yeah, you do it. That's not the case with metaphor. That's not the case with narrative. That's not the case with humor. All three of these involve learning to properly coordinate the relationship between the left and right hemisphere. So we have to practice it with kids. We have to give them stupefyingly simplified narratives, and we practice it, and we practice it even as adults with each other. We have to do it with metaphor. Kids don't get metaphor for a very long time, and initially their metaphors, and we keep practicing it with and humor. Get a 4-year-old to tell you a joke sometime. Good luck with that, right? Same thing. So, right, there is a deeper phenomena at work here that is being misunderstood by being reduced to things like narrative and poetry. Because we want to talk about insight, we want to talk about humor, we want to talk about even what frogs are doing. And so we need a much more general account than these ways of talking about this. Now, I would argue that 4E cognitive science is exactly trying to do that. And the ways of knowing I talk about are actually trying to be grounded in more fundamental principles. Now, and at some point I'd like to talk about, why I sort of put together the 4 ways the way I do, and why I'm sort of questioning proposals about narrative and poetry. I would like to make that critique at some point. I've made it in many places. But I would like to offer the possibility that when we're talking about things like the poetic way of knowing, which is, I think, a better than narrative because it could potentially include at least metaphor in non-narrative discourse, which is huge, right? But it's still insufficient because it doesn't get insight. It doesn't capture humor. It doesn't capture also weird things we have, like some of the mistakes we make, like garden past sentences, etc. Okay. Perhaps what people are trying to point at, because Paul said something that I think is really good, that there's the propositional, and then there's the 3 other non-propositional, and the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory sort of hang together in a powerful way. And it's possible that things like metaphor and humor are designed to use propositional language in a self-subverting manner. For example, when I say a metaphor to you, I say something to you that is actually not possible as a proposition because it is self-contradictory often in some important way, right?
Right.
But the point of it is to curate and coordinate the other 3 kinds of knowing, right? Which are also, by the way, not just in the right hemisphere, right? The procedural, right? When you're first learning a procedure, it's in right hemisphere, but then it moves more into the left hemisphere. Perspectival, which has to do with consciousness, seems to involve both hemispheres. Participatory knowing, which involves the self network and the salience network, midline structures integrating front to back and side to side. That's the other thing. I mentioned this to Ian, that the front to back relationship is as important to this as the side to side relationship. It's also being left out in the left right stuff. One of the best theories of general intelligence right now is the PFIT theory, the prefrontal parietal, right? It's the front to back. In fact, there's 3 axes that we need to be talking about: left, right, front, back, and up, down. They're all important for trying to understand human cognition. So the ways of knowing are ways of trying to get things that can do that, can cut across. However, I like Paul's idea that the three, like the procedural, the perspectival, and participatory, often, like how do I use the propositional to get to them? Well, I have to use the propositional in a way, right, that I have to use the propositional, but in a way that subverts itself and helps to coordinate and curate those other three and organize them together. And that's important because that could trigger a profound kind of understanding. What I mean by that, think about understanding within a way of knowing. Like, I get a new belief from an argument, or I finally get how to catch a football. So there's understanding within the kinds of knowing. But the poetic, prophetic, I don't know what to call it, right, mode, right, would create a form of understanding that is between the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory, and also not statically, but between you, who you are and who you aspire to be. And that is a very profound kind of understanding. And I think that that's what people are trying to put their finger on.
If I could try and sum this up,
by the way, which I'll try to. Go ahead.
If I could try and sum this, would you say then that the part where you disagree on the position of narrative is that it makes more sense as a transformational technology, not as a fundamental technology?
Exactly. And I think that's properly where it's being used. So if you take a look at the work on narrative, what happens in narrative is you get a fundamental transformation of identity of the individual. What happens in narrative, and this is like sort of the cutting edge work on the psychology of narrative, is what we become temporally extended beings. So before you have narrative, you don't see all of these kinds of knowing that we're talking about, like, right, or all of these, like, sorry, that was the mistake with my taxonomy. All of these, all of these processes, like a metaphor and insight, all of those, right, they're deeply transformative. And what they involve is what Michael Apter calls a cognitive synergy. They involve a non-logical identity between two things. Like, so what you have to do in a metaphor is, well, Sam is a pig, but he's not a pig, and so it's not logical identity. But that's the problem I'm fundamentally facing as a temporally extended agent. How can I be identical to the person 30 years from now? I can't be logically identical, and categorical identity is insufficient because it just means I'm a human being. So how do I get personal identity? How do I get non-logical identity? Well, narrative affords that. There are other non-narrative ways in which we develop a personal identity. We also develop it vertically on ontological levels. Somehow you are identical to your body, but you're not logically identical to your body, right? So what narrative does is it transforms you into a temporally extended agent so that you can say, I was the child born in Dundas. I'm the person who's going to retire when I'm, 65 in Toronto, right? And I can bind all those people together. That affords my own personal distributed cognition, which ramps me up tremendously. And it makes me capable of being a moral agent because I can pursue long-term goals that require personal transformation in order to realize them. So narrative is terrifically important.
I'm almost getting the sense that this has a lot to do with, well, exactly as you pointed out, extending the temporal scale. So there's a hint of temporal learning in the procedural, for example.
Yes.
Right? Because you cannot form a procedure without temporal extension, but you can form procedures without narrative extension to some degree, kind of. But there's an implication of narrative, I would say, in procedural knowing.
So it can definitely extract them.
Right.
Exactly. I interrupted you. I just wanted to, sorry, I was just trying to strengthen your point. Yeah.
Oh,
keep
right.
going.
So yeah, I almost wonder if one way of viewing this, and it does seem, well, maybe not. I won't go there. Yeah, it seems like there are implications of our ability to deal within the temporal realm below the level of narrative, but they have such an implicated narrative form behind them that we then extend them to make sense of larger time scales where the immediate relationship between things is not nearly as obvious.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think that, but I think there are other things that are also implicated that way. I take it you're using it kind of like in a Bohmian sense, right? Because dialogue precedes narrative by 3 years minimum, maybe 4, and it makes possible the learning of dialogue it makes possible the learning of narrative, because without the dialogue, you don't get the proper attachment relationship, you don't get the shared attention, you don't learn all the skills of shifting back and forth, you don't get the beginnings of perspectival transformation, and we know that non-narrative animals are capable of this. Right? Greg and Chris and I talked about this in The Elusive Eye. If you think you have to be capable of narrative to be a self, you are just empirically wrong, because we have clear evidence for non-human organisms that have clear self-knowledge, and they're not capable of narrative. But do they have sophisticated back and forth sharing of attention, shifting of perspectives? Of course they do. Chimps actually deceive and lie to each other, which means they have a sophisticated understanding of perspectives other than their own.
Right.
And of course, you can even see this in a 2-year-old child. A 2-year-old child can't do narrative, can't even fully do language, but they'll do things like when they don't want you to see something, they'll turn it away from you like this. They can still see it, but they know that you can't. They're aware of your perspective as different from them. And they will do things like when they want you to see a picture. Even an 18-month-old will do this. They'll turn the picture around to show it to you. Right? So you can't tie these abilities to narrative. In fact, narrative presupposes these abilities. And then what you actually get, I think the phenomena we're actually interested in isn't narrative. This is another argument I want to make. Because something that bridges between the procedural, the perspectival on one hand, and the propositional on the other is pantomime. Because in pantomime, I take behavior in which I take procedures by which I interact with the world, and I turn them, like here, right? I turn them into communication to you. That's pantomime. We're doing it all the time. That's why we gesture, right? And so pantomime, it's a procedure, but it gets exacted, and it now has the features of language. So you've got pantomime, and then you've got what we're doing here, right, in dialogue. So, and what you see in for example, in the dialogues of Plato is what we have is drama. We have dramatic enactment in which we take even the words we're speaking and we make them like pantomimes. They're not about what's happening right now. They get open-ended. And Keith Oatley's done all this work on drama. And I think dialogue affords drama. That's why when we want drama, we put dialogue into narrative, even in our literature. I think dialogue affords drama, and then drama is we abstract from drama in narrative. That's what we're doing in narratives. We're abstracting from a dramatic. That's why it takes so long for kids to get it, because you can even see that progression. Dialogue, they become capable of dialogue, then they become capable of drama in play, pretend play, imaginal play, and then they become capable of narrative.
Right? It's the acting it out seemingly that actually is it's that bridge between seemingly the procedural. I mean, there's so many other aspects of knowing going into acting something out, but into the narrative form. And it really too it speaks to the embodiment that in a very deep way. Ironically, the pantomiming reveals to us something very deep about the action that we're actually taking that might not seem obvious if we are just performing the action, not in the abstract.
and notice how pantomime, first of all, in kids it precedes full-blown language, right, or anything like narrative, because in like you get the one-word gesture stage. So children will be capable of one word, and they will combine it with a gesture. Like they'll name an object and point to it. And notice how you take pointing to just be so natural to you. Try to get another organism to try it. Point.
To point.
Look at your finger. Yeah, right. And so, yeah, very much. And notice how the pantomime is always metaphorical, not in a linguistic sense, but when you're doing this with your hand, you were trying to indicate sort of further unfolding, but it goes back and makes me right, and you're trying to convey something.
The cyclical,
right?
Yeah.
Here's what I mean, right? So again, you've got proto metaphor in pantomime, etc.
Right.
Now, if that's right, and there is a way in which we can use, if things like poesis, I'll use the Greek word because it's more encompassing than poetry. If we can use poesis to curate and coordinate procedural, perspectival, and participatory transformation to afford deep understanding, then that's a way in which it could participate in or be a component of a response to suffering. Because the response to suffering is a transformation that is empowered by deep understanding. For me, that's the only morally justifiable response we can give to suffering. We're going to transform the person suffering and hopefully also the situation around the person suffering. But we're going to do that from a profound understanding. So the way we as humans deal with suffering is we try to provoke transformation, and it's only justifiable if that transformation is in the service, is being provoked by and following from the deepest possible understanding we can bring. That's how we don't bullshit ourselves in the transformation. So I could see why narrative and metaphor and humor, all of the poesis, right, is, I mean, because it's doing left-right integration, back-front integration, and also what Michael Winkelmann calls neuraxial, top-bottom integration, right? It's doing all of that, and it's giving us our best sort of, processing for both understanding the situation and transforming ourselves in the face of that understanding. And then that is at least a necessary, it's not sufficient, but it's a necessary requirement for responding to suffering. Right.
And to bring in his aspect of carrying it with community, we could then extend it into the dialogical, the
totally
right, totally. For when the individual can't carry the weight, you get these other systems that develop that in many ways are almost a fractal level of these individual forms of our personal integration.
Yes,
right.
Very much.
The left-right symmetry, the top-down symmetry, we kind of explore it out in the world, and that aids us in the integrative process. Okay. Thank you.
That was
wonderful. T.S. Apostolos asks, have you been reading René Girard? A tiny mention of him in the JBP Dialogos plus others recently. What is the greatest truth you have gleaned from his work? And then he thanks for all that you do, John. I keep coming back to your work. It's changed me.
Well, you're welcome. I mean that. I hesitate to say anything about Girard. I have not completed. I've started but not completed. I think I saw Satan Fall Like Lightning. I think that's the title of the book, maybe by Girard.
I see Satan Fall Like Lightning. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So I've read that. I've read some secondary literature. I do not consider myself, adequate to say anything profound about Girard. I need to read Girard more. The part that I've appreciated, and that was the part I was alluding to in my talk with Jordan, is his idea about sort of mimetic envy, covetousness. Yeah. I think is to use the biblical term. I think it's a theological anthropology of covetousness. Yeah. I think is profound, and it speaks to me to the importance, by the way, of perspectival and participatory knowing and transformation, because the discussion he has about the difference between envy and admiration, right? Right. And admiration is I aspire and right. Whereas envy, I want to replace you, right? I want to have what you have, right? The covetousness. Right. But those are perspectival and participatory transformations. I want to be you, and I want to know what it's like to be you. I want to have what you have. There's modal confusion in there, and I think envy is a reciprocal narrowing, whereas admiration is a reciprocal opening kind of move. And I think that and so, but his idea about how pervasive that is, and his proposal. Here's where I'm starting to move on the thin ice of my ignorance about his work. Okay, but his proposal that in Christianity, the traditional mechanism for dealing with sort of, a pandemic of mimetic malevolence is scapegoating, because it just sort of discharges it, and then it allows people to sort of reconnect by us versus them or it or whatever. And then what happens in Christianity is you have somebody who takes the role of the scapegoat, but then undermines it and explodes it from within, and then breaks the whole framework in a radical way. Now, I apologize to those of you who know Girard better, because I may be botching this. So I'm open to the fact that I need to read and understand that more. But even at that level, I appreciate that argument. I think that's a really powerful and interesting argument about, again, how powerful and important perspectival and participatory knowing is, how powerful and important distributed cognition is, because his proposal requires both of those, and then how much that actually feeds into some of our fundamental motivations. That's part of his proposal. And that Christianity tries to address this through the subversion of the scapegoat into the sacrificial victim that is also the Lord.
Right.
I think that's brilliant work. I understand, because I can already foresee that there's a lot more there. That's what I know, and that's the. And I hope that's all I was alluding to with Jordan, because that's the part I know, and I appreciate that, and I see there's I think I'm conveying that I think there's deep convergence between what Girard says about that and a lot of things I've been arguing for. And so I think that's a novel move within Christian apologetics or Christian theology. I don't know which one it is. That
a little bit of both.
yeah. I think it should be. It's worthy of further reflection and further thought.
Yeah. I mean, to my ear, I'm not super well read on Girard either, but it sounds like he hit all the major bases there. I really like how he pulled apart mythology and religion, as mythology is that which justifies the scapegoat ritual, and religion is that which subverts it. Which I thought was a really interesting take.
And that maps onto. I mean, I have there's an implicit critique of paganism there. That I would want to explicate and sort of dialogue with. But I also like the fact that it maps onto, maybe it maps on, I should be much more careful, so I'm sorry. Maybe it maps on to sort of the dipolar nature of the sacred. The sacred is that which homes us, right? But the sacred is also that which shocks us. It homes us, but it also exposes us to the numinous. So it gives us a place where we're safe. That's the justification. Because propositions make us more vulnerable than any other organism. This is Greg Enriquez's great insight. We have to justify ourselves because of propositions. The access I get to the very inner guts of your mind through your propositions that I don't get from your behavior means we have to continually defend ourselves. And if we just say that's a bad thing to do, well, then I'm just going to abandon whoever's saying that. I hope he's not saying that. But I think religion and mythology are more of a dipolarity, where there's the numinous thing that makes us subvert, right? The scapegoating that comes from our justification, but it also homes the justification and allows us protection, so we are not perpetually vulnerable in the face of other people and of ourselves. I mean, Christianity also is supposed to offer alleviation from guilt.
See, yeah, now we're getting into an interesting theological space, I think, to continue further in this direction. Um,
Sorry, I shouldn't
right.
have done
It's no,
that.
no, no. It's super interesting. Um, I think in some ways, I remember before, right, in some sense, moving forward from here, there's a kind of finding a home in domicide, right?
Yeah,
Where our
yeah, yeah,
sense of comfort expands beyond the walled
yeah,
garden, in a sense.
yeah,
And I would
yeah,
say
yeah,
that that's analogous to vulnerability in the sense that we're speaking about it now. That in the
yeah,
same way that not having a home is extraordinarily vulnerable, so too does it offer us a larger sense of security if we can
yeah,
move through it. And I would say
yeah.
there's something about that with what Girard is pointing to.
Right. The thing that I would say to that, and then I won't keep, uh, that move predates Christianity. That move is the move, it's
Right.
classically the move of the Cynics, and then it's taken up by the Stoics. That's what they mean by being
Right.
cosmopolitan, that the cosmos is your polis, right? You're at
Right.
home in the cosmos. And that,
Right.
right? And so in the Cynics and the Stoics um, made that argument. And of course,
Well, and
they have a huge influence on Christianity.
they do. Would you say then that where Christianity diverges from that is literally in the replacement of home in a more embodied sense to a more I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. The emphasis on faith, in my mind, takes us in a different direction than
Mm,
we find
it's
with
interesting.
the Stoics.
You into faith, and maybe what I'm going to say isn't opposite to that. Maybe because I was going to go to agape. So
Oh,
so
interesting. Okay.
the Stoics basically say the mind can make a home no matter where it is. And they get that from the Cynics, and then what they do is the Cynics think you have to be outside of civilization to do that. The Stoics say no, you can do that even within civilization. There's a lot more, but
Right.
that's but what I hear the Christians saying with agape is no. You're not getting it. You're not getting it. What fundamentally makes a home is that which makes persons, and what the process that makes persons is agape. And so wherever you have agape, you have the capacity to make communities of persons, and that is properly what home is. That's what I hear Christianity saying.
Right. Well, and that very much alleviates, because what is the obsession with the propositional and the vulnerability that we are defending ourselves from is largely tied to our identity, literally our sense
Yeah,
of our own personhood. So having that or that kind of polarity between agape, this
yeah,
energy, this
yeah,
force, if you will, that reestablishes your being against the vulnerability of the propositional, right?
yeah,
That is trying to eat away at your
yep, yep,
sense
yep.
of being. Okay, that was
Okay,
fun.
Nick,
I really liked that.
that gets us, that would get us properly into a deep discussion of logos, because logos is precisely to connect on one end to the propositional, but gathering things together so they belong together, which also connects it to agape. So it's connecting us to the propositional, the logos, while also homing us in agape against too much exposure, too much of vulnerability that makes the mimetic malevolence so powerfully
Right,
dangerous.
right, right. Oh, that is wonderful. Yeah. As always, we end up in these situations where the answer gives you this dynamic vision that immediately has a tendency to be inconvenient in a propositional sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good marker of dialogos when you get that kind of aphoretic disruption, right? And then when you get that,
Right,
because
right.
that's for me. That's for me. That's for me the sense of the presence of the logos, because something is coming in and it's smashing our best laid plans, of how the proposition should unfold.
Right. Oh, it's wonderful. Okay. Okay. That was a lot of fun. Let's move on to musical keys question here. During the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, there was only one part that struck me as wrong intuitively. When you said the John Vervaeke existing forever would be an ontological mistake. I am wondering why immortality would be a mistake, considering the fact that we can always learn and transform in deep ways through the very mechanisms you elucidate. Do you believe it would be an ontological mistake, for example, for your son to live forever, even if he believed he could make it worth the cost?
So let me answer the first part. The issue about my son is, I want to answer that without being presumptuous, because I think this is a question that is really properly only answered by each person.
Right.
Precisely because it requires the very transformation that's being indicated. Here, my concern when I said that is that, okay, let me try and do my concern, and then so to say I want to live forever is to say somehow there will be an identity that's preserved. Now, the problem for that is if I go from, Wittgenstein constantly reminded us, don't confuse an image with making a full-blown proposal, a set of propositions. I can imagine somebody on the sun looking at the watch saying, what time is it on the sun? But even though I can form that image, it doesn't make any sense to ask what time is it on the sun, because what time it is relative to where you are on the earth, right? Or what's north of the North Pole. I can imagine somebody at the North Pole sort of looking around, but that doesn't mean I'm saying anything meaningful. Okay, so we have to go beyond the picture. So what is it I want? Well, I don't just want me to not change. I don't want my son to die. I don't want my partner to die. But they have people that they're connected, and they don't want, you know what's going to happen? Nobody can die. It's going to freed out that nobody can die. And also all of the conditions that preserve them the way they are, none of those, I basically want to freeze the universe from change. And to me, that's an absurd requirement. Well, you say, no, I'm going to let everything change. Okay, so now I'm going to let everything change, and I am going to be changing with it. I notice how much I've changed from how I am now from when I was 10. And so that identity is more tenuous to me than the identity I have between how I am now and how I am when I was 40. How I am now and how I was when I'm 5, that's a very tenuous connection. So take how I am now and extend it to infinity. Is that person going to have any connection to John now? No. So John, if he's going to go through perpetual transformation, is going to, everything about me that is me is going to completely disappear. And also, and whoever and whatever that is through time is going to make engage in all kinds of vicious behavior, also virtuous. I'm trying to keep it open, but all kinds of vicious behavior. And am I supposed to take responsibility for that now? I should be responsible for all the sins that future John X or John 17.0 is going to commit. Does that John way in the future have to take responsibility? And then you say, oh no, we're going to live in heaven and we're never going to take responsibility. That's the freezing hypothesis that I don't agree with. Right. As you're saying, everything's going to change and we're all going to just stay virtuous. Then you're denying transformation. Then you're freezing the world. And I don't want to live in that, because that sounds like a definition of hell. So for me, I can't get to a place in which I can see an infinity of life and of identity and meaning all being coordinated together in a coherent fashion. Now, about my son, I don't want to ever see my son die, but that's not the same thing as wanting him to live forever. Those aren't the two things, right? I can imagine that Jason could come to a place 3,000 years from now, like I did in the story with Julian Barnes, where he is complete, like in a spoiler, close your ears if you have not watched The Good Place. Close your ears. But if you've watched The Good Place, the ending of The Good Place is they all come to the realization that they want to pass out of being, because they have come to fulfillment. I can see Jason getting to that place and saying, I want to cease to exist. Could you unplug the cord, please? I'm done. I'm finished. I'm a finite being. You know, Herman Melville said, what is man that he should desire to live out the lifetime of his God? Right? That's like, and so it's like, no, I'm properly a finite thing. I am properly a mortal. And to deny that is to fundamentally subvert my identity, my humanity, my possibility of coming to fulfillment. That's how I.
So
think
you are radically Buddhist in that sense, I would say, right? Because it seems like the
So
two
what
errors you
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In that sense, right? The Buddhism, at least the version, there's many versions, but the version I am familiar with, you properly practice the horror of immortality, and this is the thing.
Right.
You see this in Vedanta, you see this in Buddhism, you can even see this in certain versions of the horror of the immortals in Taoism. There's a terrific horror of immortality in the East, and we just take it for granted that it's natural. Well, human beings want to live forever. Do they? I'm not sure, because there's world religions that properly tutor people in being horrified at immortality.
That is really interesting. They always tie the achievement of immortality with a very deep sense of corruption in the East.
Yes. So
I mean, to the
Nirvana,
point of being
moksha,
infected
or
by
release.
parasites, or right, the parasites are what offer the reconstruction, or there's all these images that always deal with that imagery.
You're endlessly cycling, right? So think of like Vedanta or parts of Hinduism. Like you'll go all the way up to godhood, and then you'll become Indra. You know the story of Indra, where he's getting this guy to build him a temple, and because he's such a great god, because he's killed the dragon and all this. And then the guy who's building it, Indra keeps adding rooms, and I'm going to be doing this forever. Can you save me? And I think it's Brahma comes in, and he makes all these ants walk by, and there's millions of ants walking by. And Indra looks at them, and he says, what's wrong with all the ants? And Brahma says, each one of those is a previous Indra. He went up, came back down.
Right.
So there's this horror. There's this horror in the East. So moksha, right, release, nirvana, blowing out the candle. Nirvana is not immortality. Nirvana is the sensation. It's neither being nor not being, technically, for the Buddhists, because they're trying to break the frame, right? But yeah, right. I find it comforting that I will end.
Right.
And I know that that people don't like that. I get it. And I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm just trying to be honest.
It is interesting because I actually bizarrely agree with you, even from my kind of more Christian perspective. So I'm not sure quite how to, when I always deal with this question, like I can't stand depictions of what heaven is like. Like it drives me nuts. Like the promise is fine, but I hope it is so indescribably different than my simulations of it that I just leave it as this suspended mystery, if you will, without trying to intrude on whatever it might mean. So I certainly understand.
Well, thank you for that. That was kind of you. This is another place, by the way, where Jonathan is more radical Christian than many people realize, because Jonathan's model is Eastern Orthodox, which is theosis, right? Which is not just salvation. It's not just transposition, whatever that means, to heaven. It's deification. It's so that you are properly ontologically changed. Now, this is right out of the Neoplatonic tradition, right? You are properly changed to the kind of being that could sustain an existence in eternity and everlastingness. Eternity is not the same thing as everlastingness, but somehow links the two together. That's a very radical model, because that changes. I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of Eastern Orthodoxy. I hope I'm not offending Jonathan if he's watching this. If he comes to watch this, but I mean, that's a more radical proposal of salvation than you get in the versions of Christianity that have been deeply informed by modernity. because
Right.
think about Jordan
Absolutely.
Peterson. Jordan Peterson and the veneration of the individual. That's not what's happening in theosis. That's not what's happening, at least to my understanding of it. Now, it's not just absorption and disappearance. I'm not trying to make theosis also disappearance, but it's also not. Yeah, it's something other than the
Right.
models getting into modernity.
Well, now we're back in our tossing between the hemispheres,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
in some direction, probably multiple. Okay, let's see. Jeff P asks, oh, this one looks more personal. We also are closing in on time. We've got about 10 minutes until the 2 hour mark, so uh, we'll try and get through a number of these, hopefully, but if not, it
That's
doesn't
right.
matter. Um, Jeff P asks, "Hi John, when you focused on Christianity in your Aft MC series, I find your presentation of agape as nothing short of gorgeous. Certainly better than any pastor I heard growing up in church. So thank you for sharing that. From your discussions with Paul, I remember hearing that you grew up in a religious atmosphere that sounded somewhat traumatic. I'm curious, and of course, if you don't feel comfortable sharing, I certainly understand. What was the name of the sect or denomination you were raised in, and does it still exist?"
I'm not going to say the name of the sect precisely because it still exists and my extended family belongs to it. And for that reason,
I
out
see.
of my concern for them, I don't want to label them.
Absolutely.
That's not fair to them. It is a form of fundamentalist Protestantism um, that is very creedal in orientation, emphasizes sort of rituals of guilt and conviction in both senses of the word, and requires, understands, I guess the right word, yeah, I think it is, understands worship as kind of the relationship you would have to some sort of Mongolian despot or something. That there's this king of
Right.
this vast realm, and you must almost grovel and sycophantic relationship to them because of the terrific power that they wield. And
Right.
Nietzsche's critique of that there are forms of Christianity that are forms of resentment. Jordan Peterson talks about this precisely because they're barely disguised worship of the power that people crave, but they don't actually have as neglected
Right.
underclass or whatever. And so it was very much that for me. And so I come to understand, and I keep trying to understand. It's one of the reasons why I talk to Paul and Jonathan and J.P. Marceau and Mary Cohen, because they help me. And I mean that deeply. They help me. I'm talking to you. You're helping me. I want to, and I read a lot and I study a lot because I want to understand Christianity more broadly. One of the criticisms that the randos made of me is that I should know better. In that when I make some of my criticisms or when I state some of my resistance to Christianity, I should know better. I should know that there are deeper, more profound versions of Christianity out there that don't carry with them that. And that's fair. I think that's fair, and I'll try to be responsive to that. I would ask, in fairness, if they tried to understand that while that is true, I practice science. Many of you don't.
Right.
Just like I don't practice Christianity. I practice science, and I love it. I deeply love how it works and what it does. So because I love it, because I practice it, I have a deep loyalty and allegiance to it that is as worthy of respect as your allegiance to your religion. Why is he so committed to science? That's not fair. That part of the criticism I will push back against. The part of the criticism that I need to open up and try, and I have tried, but I think it's right, it's a fair criticism. haven't tried well enough, but I keep at least entering into good faith dialogue to try and to more appropriately understand and appreciate Christianity as a way of being fair to people of good faith and people of virtue and integrity and wisdom, like yourself, like Paul, like Jonathan, everybody. And also to help me with, and this part, it's self-centered, but I hope it's not selfish, help me to overcome the way in which that still wounds me. I foresee that even after considerable therapy and a lot of work, that I won't ever be completely free from that wound. And so that limits me to some degree into which Christianity can be viable to me.
Right.
So
right.
That's where I'm at.
That is a totally fair response. And it is interesting. I think perhaps it's some part of it is because so much of the culture is swimming in science that they don't realize, and I say this of myself as well, they don't realize the unfairness of the critique while speaking from a religious point of view. And the way that you framed that by making it comparable, right? You practice this, I practice this. We both care about these things that we spend a lot of time practicing. I think that being able to open up the conversation in that way is extremely important. And
thank you.
Yeah, that really is a useful and totally fair distinction.
Thank you. I do want to be responsible to the fact that I might be inflicting a biased model of Christianity on Christians in a way that's unfair to them. I do want to be responsible to that. I take that seriously. I think that was a very fair and good criticism.
Right. Well, and we all do. I mean, to be aware of it and to try and work towards it is as much as anyone could ever hope to ask or hope for from another person. So, and I think you do that very well.
Well, thank you for that. That's encouraging. Thank you.
All right. And I think if we can maybe squeeze one more in, we got about 2 or 3 minutes.
Yep.
Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to find one that isn't going to lead to another very extended conversation.
So
here,
now
maybe this one.
Oh, good.
Hey, John, this is from Pierre Axel 777. Hey, John, what would you tell your 23-year-old self?
Lighten up. Don't take yourself quite so seriously, and thereby be less judgmental about other people.
Definitely. Sorry.
One of the things I inherited, and I'm still working on it, from that form of Christianity was being judgmental. There was a lot of judging going on, even though Jesus famously warned against being judgmental. He didn't warn against judgment, he warned against being judgmental. At least that's my reading of that part of the Gospels. Because we have to make judgments. Like, should I go to college? We have to make judgments. So he doesn't mean that. That would be ridiculous. But I think he means being judgmental as a personality pathway. And so, while I abandoned in my 20s in kind of a very, violent almost kind of, I don't mean physically, but argumentatively, kind of atheism, I didn't realize that I was just simply negating it. I was still, although propositionally I was no longer in that sect, I was still procedurally doing the same thing. I was incredibly judgmental, and I hurt people, and I don't mean that was just in my 20s. This has been something, hopefully, that's been attenuating, but something that I have to continually be vigilant on, because your mother religion is like your mother tongue. It goes into the very guts of your psyche, and trying to free yourself from the vices that have been inculcated by it is a lifetime project. But if I could talk to my 23-year-old self, I would say that, and I would try to get him to step back from battling the propositions and pay attention to the patterns of the behavior and say, you're actually still doing it. The very thing you're trying to free yourself from, you're just still doing it, and you're still doing it in a more duplicitous fashion. You're deceiving yourself, and you're doing it in a way that's hurting other people. And it's not allowing you to be open to, I'll use a Christian term here because we're talking about a Christian context. It's not allowing you to be open to forgiveness.
Right.
You have to find a better balance, an optimal grip between holding people responsible and holding yourself responsible, and also affording forgiveness, forgiving other people, genuinely forgiving, not pretending to forgive, but really forgiving, which is really hard.
Yeah.
But it's also ultimately something you can't do, something that you have to participate in. Also forgiving myself. One of the things that therapy does it sounds like a Hallmark card, but it's not. One of the things that good therapy does is get you to the place where you really forgive yourself in a way that is inseparably bound up with you forgiving other people. And I'm still learning that. That is something that I would properly count myself as a novice in. But I would try to encourage my younger self to give more time and attention and genuine consideration to that project earlier on, because a lot of suffering could have been reduced.
That's a wonderful answer. My mind immediately wants to go in a bunch of theological directions, but we are at the end of our time here. John, I want to say thank you so much. This was an absolutely lovely discussion. I'm sorry to the people that asked questions that I did not get to. I was trying to balance a depth of conversation with trying to get through everybody's offerings here. So hopefully I found something there that worked. And again, thank you so much, John. That was really wonderful.
Well, thank you, Nick. You did not in any way offend me, and I felt welcome, and you really, really afforded genuine dialogos, and so thank you for that.
Thank you much.